thank you all for having me tonight and sharing some time. And what I'm going to do is to try to very quickly get through a lot and leave time for a good conversation, a good Q&A. If we can save the conversation and the discussion for after the brain dump, that would be terrific. It would allow me to get through things more quickly. I am John Kaehny, and I did have fun as head of transportation alternatives, and I am very lucky to be the executive director of Reinvent Albany right now. We're a 501c3 nonprofit group that is located here in New York City. We are co-located with Open Plans that some of you may know, and David Moore and other illustrious figures in social change and civic technology, and we have a great workplace not so far from here. I'm actually going to talk mainly about Albany stuff and state government, though I would love to talk about city government. It is so much more fun, and but I'm going to restrain myself and not do that. A couple really important things. City and states are almost mirror images of each other. Cities are places that provide direct services to people. About 2/3 of all the money that New York City spends and most localities spend is on direct services. Schools, policing, fire, stuff like that. Repaving your streets, a little tiny bit on things like bicycling. States are the opposite. States provide far fewer direct services, and their main job is to take money from the federal government and to take money up from localities and local taxpayers and redistribute that money back down to cities and towns. And as a result of that fact, there's much, much less everyday customer service or contact with the public with state government because the state is not delivering a direct service. The interesting part about states, and in case New York State, we'll just talk about New York State, is that the part that provides the most direct services are public authorities. And public authorities are, for instance, the MTA. Probably the main one that affects the life of New York City residents. So actual state government, the agencies that the governor directly controls and appoints the head of, provide relatively small number of services. They're mainly agencies that do things like send Medicaid money and Medicare money down to localities or local granting. And this is really, really important for government transparency and public involvement. So we started Reinvent Albany in 2010, we being myself and a number of major funders of livable streets and transportation things over beer, because there's no better way to start a social change group than over beer. And basically we were sitting moaning and kvetching about how lame our state government was. And as New York City residents, what if anchor it was on the ingenuity and creativity and innovation that we have and enjoy here in New York City. So push came to shove, and we started Reinvent Albany in 2010, which happened to be an election year. And one of the big focuses of Reinvent Albany was trying to get the next governor, who at that time was going to be Andrew Cuomo, and we knew, to adopt some open government policies. And when I say open government, I'm not limiting that to open data. I'm using open government synonymously with transparency and with the basic doctrine or concept that the public has a right to know what government knows and how government reaches decisions. And so that's our basic ideology. We believe that fundamental to any democracy, that the public and the voter has a right to know what government knows and what government is doing and how government is spending our tax dollars, which may seem self-evident to you, but is not self-evident to people in Albany and other places. So I'm going to run through some slides real quick and talk about some of the things that we've done in Reinvent Albany with a heavy focus on technology platforms and transparency that use the internet and to increase public understanding of government activities. That's not all we work on, but that's going to be the skew of what I talk about here. But I just want to say a couple things to start with. Where we are now in the history of New York State is at a very low point when it comes to corruption and the influence of money and power in influencing how decisions for everyone are made. This is not normal. Albany has been a symbol of corruption and dysfunction for a very long time, but where we are now is particularly bad because of what's happening in the United States with Supreme Court rulings and the fact that there is an intense income inequality in this country, massive corporate profits and enormous, enormous sums of money entering the political system that are ahistoric. We now have more money adjusted for inflation in our political system than ever before by far. So what, when you read the negative headlines and you hear the, wow, this is terrible, it is really bad, okay? This is not just the normal bitching and moaning. But I want to talk about this because we're going to go into some stuff that's pretty depressing, and and it's reality, but it's depressing. I think what's happening right now in New York and in the United States and in Western democracies is a collision of the proverbial irresistible force and the immovable object. And this, my friends, is the irresistible force. The smartphone, the information revolution, the empowerment of the internet, the interweb, this is changing public expectations and changing everything. Nothing is the same. Yesterday is not the same as today because new technology tools, new social networks, new ways of communicating, and new ways of sharing information are coming incredibly quickly, as folks in this room know, versus the immovable object, which is a status quo political system that is absolutely, absolutely submerged in massive amounts of money. Big explosion, and that's what we're about to see, okay? And that's what we are trying to change. We're trying to use this irresistible force, this smartphone, to change this giant, stationary, money-besotted, dysfunctional government system that we have right now. Let me just talk a little bit about who I am. As Noel said, I come at Reinvent Albany and government reform from a long background in livable streets and transit and bicycling and pedestrian rights. And my experience there taught me a lot about how government actually works, how to pass laws. I learned a lot about freedom of information law and a lot about the power of data to make a case for policy change and social change. So I'm a policy expert with deep experience in grassroots organizing and policy research and change. Reinvent Albany is a nonprofit group that does not endorse candidates or take positions on ballot initiatives. We are funded by some wealthy individuals and by some foundations like the Omidyar Democracy Fund. And we have a staff of 3, usually 1 full-time intern, and then we use consultants, including some folks here at BetaNYC like John Kraus, who I have not met in person yet, but who does scraping for us. New Amsterdam Ideas, which is a firm that headed by Andrew Hoppin, and other technology firms to help us with scraping, open data consultancies, and other things. So we effectively are about 6 to 10 people in terms of our total effort that we put out in the state. Let me see if I can use the fast forward button and it works. So open government, we talked about that. It's an expectation that the public gets to see what government is doing and has access to that information. I just want a word on open government. We use open government in the traditional sense that it's been used for over 100 years, which is open government. We do not use open government to mean just open data. I think open data is super important, but open data does not equal sign open government. We can talk about this. This is kind of the universe of our friends or colleagues or people we interact with a lot. You can see that there's groups from the left and the right in here, and both from labor and from business-backed groups. So there's a tremendous interest in transparency and open government in New York. And in fact, New York has among the strongest, most robust discussion among groups of different kinds in the entire country. It's an area that we should be proud of in terms of a true bipartisan or bi-ideological or trans-ideological interest in transparency. We were very lucky that the right-wing guys in this state are way better than a lot of states, I will say that. A couple things that we've worked on or helped win or helped champion. This is Open New York, this state's open data platform. It was just rated one of the top 6 in the entire country by a national open data group. The state open data policy was created by the governor. Executive Order 95, if you want to read it, is pretty good. We helped also work with the governor's office to get New York State open budget, which is a machine-readable budget for those of you working on that for New York City, something the state has that the city does not have. How about that? So there, you can go check that out, machine-readable, do whatever you want to with it. New York Performs, performance management platform that is actually operating and is not been shown to the public yet. And we spent a lot of time hopefully getting that shown to the public. But the governor's office operates that. And that is in the SAGE Commission report, in case you're interested. So we would love to see that come out. New York Open Government Upgrade. This is a super cool site by the State Attorney General's office that is one of the most powerful transparency open government sites in the United States right now. It's a mashup of campaign contributions, state contracts, and lobbying data in one place. So if you enter in my name in this, if you go online, or your name, you will see all the campaign contributions, lobbying, and contracts that you got right there in one site. Unfortunately, this site's kind of fallen apart a little bit, but they had the right idea. This was started by Andrew Cuomo as Attorney General, continued by Eric Schneiderman. This has the potential to blow the doors off of transparency, but has not been invested in or upgraded adequately. But it is an awesome model, and if there was a little bit more investment in this, it would be a very, very big deal. Open Book New York is the comptroller's site, and which we have spent a ton of time working with the comptroller's office to try to improve and get better. For those of you who really geek out on government data, New York State and New York City are very interesting. They're two of the few government enterprises in the United States that have a single spending database or processing system for all agencies. So the city and state have this. This is actually quite an important but boring thing, because it means that the public can see that if government chooses to expose it. This is how the state exposes what's called the state financial system, which is a checkbook level expenditure of all state spending. And the city does it through Checkbook NYC 2.0 or Checkbook 2.0, which some of you may see. The city has a thing called the FMS, Financial Management System. This is really unusual basic transparency, and the city and state are miles ahead of the world in this regard. So something to flag here that we actually do kind of right. This also has contract spending, payments, blah, 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 other stuff too. There's just a look at that. Other stuff we work on is policy research. We're super interested in the connection between FOIL and open data. FOIL, Freedom of Information Law, is the old paradigm. It's the way that people used to get information, and still do, and still is by far the most powerful and important transparency tool that we have and that journalists have. So what we would like to see is that instead, and I think that everybody here is like, yeah, duh, this is self-evident. We would like to see Freedom of Information requests used as a way to identify what data sets should be put up first under open data, right? So we did this report called Listening to FOIL, and that report looked at the State Department of Environmental Conservation's FOIL database, logs. Turns out you can FOIL requests, so we did. And we looked at 5,000 FOIL requests, and what we found were that half are going to two databases that have to do with hazardous waste and water problems on parcels of land. And it turns out that every single time a business or a person buys land, the bank or the lender wants to know if they're lending to a hazardous waste site. So what we suggested with this report, which just came out, was, and this is the first time in the US that anybody has actually done this, even though we've been talking about it for a long time, we finally did it, that we suggested to the State Environment Agency that, yes, put those data sets online. Why do this stuff? This is craziness. So we've done tons of research on FOIL. You can check it out on our website, reinventalbany.org. And we're going to continue to be releasing reports on FOIL. This got a ton of press within the OpenGov listserv world nationally. People thought this was the coolest thing, though we thought it was pretty lame that, nobody else had already done this already, because it's a pretty obvious thing, right? Look at FOIL requests, see what people are foiling, and see what data sets they refer to. But everyone should do that. Another thing we're working on right now, which is, some folks here may have seen, ProPublica did a big piece on this just a couple weeks ago, August 11th, is the state of New York now has a 90-day email auto-destruction policy. So unless you flag an email manually, your email will be destroyed after 90 days. So think about that for a second. I mean, go look at your inbox. Those of you who have 7,000 emails in your inbox or whatever it is, and then think about having to flag every one of those emails into one of 200 different schedules for archiving that the state has. We're super alarmed about this 90-day auto email destruct policy, because it's one way. And there's no such thing as email police. There's no audits, there's no oversight. Once that email is gone, it's gone. So what that means is if you file a FOIL request or a legal discovery, and you're not going to find emails older than 90 days anymore, unless someone has gone out of their way to conscientiously put them in the right archiving schedule, to save that email. So that is a big, big deal. And we're organizing a coalition right now that's going to be asking the governor to change that. Turns out there is no best practice email retention policy for any state or city in the United States. So the city of New York doesn't have one. The state of New York has this terrible 90-day auto-destruct policy, but no one has a policy that that expert types think is the best. So, which is kind of a stunning thing when you think about it. Anyway, so we get sucked into all kinds of fights over transparency and, the modern, information system and governance. Something that folks may find interesting, we built a notional website that would be the campaign finance system processing for the state of New York in case New York ever adopts public financing, public matching program like New York City has. It's called the State Open Campaign System. I think there's 300 wireframes. All the functionality is laid out exactly how to do it. The state has a lot of interest in that, and it's online. This is what the best practice would look like, can look like for the technology platform or the public-facing part that supports public campaign financing. This is how candidates would report how much money they got and how you could see that. And this is based on New York City's Campaign Finance Board's C-SMART system. We do a lot of other stuff outside of the transparency realm. We have a whole area called fiscal honesty, which is, people always laugh when we go to Albany, like, our program's called fiscal honesty, ho, ho, ho. And anyway, we were the guys that were behind championing the transit lockbox bill, which just simply said, if you steal money, you being the Department of the Budget, Division of the Budget, and the governor and the legislature, if you steal dedicated transit funds, you have to tell the public that you took them. That's all it actually says. You can see there was a ton of groups that supported that bill. That bill was vetoed. And then there was Lockbox 2. Again, tons of groups, all kinds of groups, enviro groups, transit groups, good government groups. That bill was vetoed. So passed the legislature unanimously. We think dedicated funds are super duper important because they are supposed to be protected to serve a specific purpose. In this case, money for the MTA or other transit systems to run subways and buses. But it turns out that Albany takes somewhere between $500 to $700 million a year in dedicated funds that are supposed to be for things like this, or, we put the wrong slide in there. I don't know if anybody here read about sewage clean water funds being used to build the Tappan Zee Bridge. We were involved in that fight. There we go. Right slide there. But that's the kind of fights that we get involved in when we're not working on open data and transparency stuff. Noel mentioned the New York City Transparency Working Group. That's a group that we help coordinate, that Noel helped form, that BetaNYC is a member of. And that's basically a leadership forum that meets with city elected officials, city council members, and is kind of the one-stop shop, very, very privately and quietly, since we're being webcast, through which city agencies and the city council meet with advocates and talk to them about legislation, policy issues, and various things. So that's the forum in which we developed the city's open data law. We helped develop the city's webcasting law and policy, and where we talk to city agencies and the mayor's office about how to make things better. And you can see, as Noel was saying, it's a mixture of new groups and old groups. And our hope there, and this is why I think BetaNYC is really important, is to bring the old line good government groups like NYPIRG and Citizens Union and NYCLU and other folks here into the modern information age. And I want to just keep coming back. I think the folks that are in this room right now are enormously important. Everybody here, you are more important than you think, because you are in the vanguard of people that understand how to use technology and understand some of the implications of the smartphone, of mobile, of APIs, of open data. And not that many people get that. So having you folks out there talking to elected officials, talking to civic groups, talking to even friends that work for government or for civic groups is super important, more than you think, because this stuff is so new. New York City stuff, I'm going to zoom through this. We work on tons of New York City stuff, but we're going to just zoom through this. New York City Open Data Law, Checkbook NYC, we helped with rolling out. That is an open source platform in case you're interested and you somehow can figure out how to use the code. Good luck. It's pretty unlikely. We can talk about what real open source means later. We helped get the Mayor's Management Report digitized. It took forever. There it is. And right now we're working with many groups, including you guys, on Open FOIL, which would put freedom of information law in New York City all online and all requests through a centralized portal. And the idea behind this is not only to make FOIL work better, but also to be able to see what people are FOILing as a way of getting that proactively online through open data. It's an open data diagnostic tool, or radar, or sensor, or whatever you want to call it. So we hope that this will pass in the next year or so. I'm going to give us a long time. We have 24 City Council co-sponsors, and you can see a ton of major groups right there. If you are interested in that, let us know. info@reinventalbany.org. Email us. Hell, you can just email us for fun anyway. We like getting emails. So anyway, this is a big project in New York City right now. Again, lots of policy reports, FOIL, open data, government transparency. It's all on our website. You can check it out. I'm going to zoom through some cool stuff that's happening at the state. Again, the focus is on platforms. So for all these platforms here, and for every technology platform you see, you have to remember that there has to be a law, a policy, an administrative order, an executive order, or some kind of order that requires the reporting that requires the agency to actually produce the data that goes into the platform, right? So it's a very long chain. It is a very long data chain. And at any point, that can fail. And you can get either no data, or old data, or inadequate or inefficient, incomplete data. So this is a super important thing to remember. Some of these are going to be redundant. But basically, the world that we're most interested in when it comes to transparency, oops, sorry about that, I'm wandering. What we're most interested in is how does government spend our tax dollars, and how does government, and who gets those tax dollars, and how are those decisions made? Basic transparency stuff. We just saw a whole bunch of these. There's a ton of websites and a ton of public data available in New York State that you can use to help analyze what government is doing. In fact, there's just incredible amounts. The issue that we have and that other advocates and journalists have is that most of that data does not speak to most of the decisions that are being made that affect people the most. So, for instance, the state's biggest projects, the Tappan Zee Bridge, for instance, a $4 billion highway and road project, has no financial plan. There is no financial plan. There is no plan to explain how the biggest road or bridge project in New York State is going to be paid for. So transparency only goes so far, and open data only goes so far when there is no plan and when government rejects FOIL requests. We'll get into hidden spending in a second, but there's a ton of stuff that we can't see that's really important. In fact, that's like a massive thing, and it's depressing. Open Book New York, we looked at that again. New York Open Government Authority's Budget Office, one of the worst websites around, super important. Authorities have about $50 billion in annual spending in New York, and New York gave birth in 2009 to a law that took 20 years to pass called the Public Authorities Reporting Act, or PARA. It was enormous effort by good government groups and a couple of crusading state assembly members to pass it. That data from that gets reported to the Public Authority Reporting Information System, or PARIS, and PARIS you can find on this website. If people here like to scrape or write, scrapers, talk to us. All the data that's being reported through this super important law that reports how $50 billion worth of contracts are awarded how $50 billion worth of capital spending is done, is all in PDF. It's all in PDF. And if we have an unlimited need to turn that into digitized tabular data. So if you are into that stuff, this is really, really high quality stuff. What are we talking about here? Like the MTA's procurement. Who is the MTA paying? Stuff like that. Who is the Thruway Authority paying? Who is the Power Authority paying? That is in PDF format. So we just scraped the MTA's vendors from 2012 to see how long it would take and what we would have to do with that. And that's going to come out in a report in about 2 weeks or so with recommendations on MTA transparency. We have to scrape the PDFs, and we'll talk about that in a second if folks are into it. John Kraus, who is a BetaNYC guy, was the guy who scraped it for us. New York State open budget. This is the machine-readable budget that New York City doesn't have. Open in New York. This is New York's open data platform. Very, very cool. We're extremely proud of the work that we helped contribute to the state's open data platform, which is a Socrata platform. As Chris can tell you, we're particularly happy that Health Data NY, which is right here, got the biggest federal award for health data. And in this place, in this way, New York State is actually, global leader right now because of the health data that they've put out, which has been everything from epidemiological data, how diseases spread, to hospitalization rates, to how much different procedures cost, to all kinds of stuff. The New York Times has written 3 cover stories based on New York State health data. And this is a really interesting thing because nowhere have they credited the source of that as being the New York State's health data or data.ny.gov as their source for that. It just kind of magically, this data, which was reported by the state. And I point that out because some of the biggest success stories in open data, you don't know that they're open data success stories because they're not credited that way, because the New York Times did not write a big open data success story. They didn't write that. What they wrote was, how come this hospital in upstate charges 10 times as much for a hip replacement as everybody else? That was one of the Times stories. You can go find that. So that was a story about hip replacement that was really an open data story. We talked about listening to FOIL, and so there's good stuff happening. There's people hard at work. We are winning some things. We are somewhat effectual sometimes in some places. And then here's the really bad part, which is a lot. Most people in New York think that corruption's a big problem here. And they're right. Not only are they right, but here's, I think, the most authoritative study of corruption risk in the state. That looked at more than 250 different criteria. And across the board, New York did very, very badly in corruption risk. Does that mean that New York is corrupt in all those areas? No. What it means is that the potential corruption is very, very high because spending is not transparent, because we don't know who's getting money, because we don't know who's making decisions as to who gets the money, because it would be very, very easy for the process to be corrupted there. Moreland Commission. Anybody here heard of the Moreland Commission? How familiar are people with that? Yes, exciting, Moreland Commission. No one actually cares that much about the Moreland Commission in the general public because no one really gets what the hell it's about. It was supposed to be a commission that took on government corruption in New York State, and it was closed down prematurely by the governor. However, in the time that it was around, it found out a lot of things. And this is a commission that was created by an incumbent governor, and it's pretty damning. So I'm just going to read this. Public corruption has become all too commonplace and has eroded the public trust and confidence, undermines the trust of the people, and diminishes the ability of government to function. And how does it do that? Mainly by creating cynicism and the belief in people that nothing they do can change anything and that voting doesn't matter. So why do you guys matter? You don't think that because you understand the power of the change that is happening right now because you are seeing it and you are experiencing it as technologists. And I think this is really, again, an important thing because what we have now is not going to last forever. Pay to play. Anybody here heard that term, pay to play? Pay to play. Again, it just means corruption that's legal. That's it. So pay, campaign contributions, play, all the ways that government can give you money to make you rich or do what you want. The Moreland Commission said Albany's pay-to-play culture is greased by a campaign finance system. Play. Play is where we play. Let me just go back real quick. Pay, the pay side. We don't work on this, okay? Groups like NYPIRG, Citizens Union, Common Cause, they work on campaign finance limits and things like that. We do not work on that. Why would we not work on that? We don't work on it because we don't think our ability, we can add a whole hell of a lot to what groups have been working on for, roughly 100 years on this issue. Our friends work on it, we know about it, but this is not a big thing for us. It is super important though, but I'm not going to talk about it now because you've read about public campaign matching systems and things like that. But really, to change the pay-to-play culture, we need a public matching system, and indeed, that's what the Moreland Commission recommended, and that's what all the good government groups in New York want to do, as well as most Americans and most New Yorkers. Play is where we play. Play is looking out at how government spends its money and how it gives money to people. Just a couple things that are mind-bogglers here. The state has about $140 billion annual budget, and that's a ton of money. There's a couple pieces though that are just crazy. State is giving out $420 million a year in tax credits to film and TV production companies for film productions without disclosing who's getting the money. Okay, those are our tax dollars. Tax expenditures and tax credits are our tax dollars going to these guys, and they're not disclosed. I mean, that's fairly mind-boggling. Anyway, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about Spider-Man, the Spider-Man series and things like that. Spider-Man got roughly $35 million in tax credits. Anyway, state budget's $140 billion. A couple green items. I just did a quick little green, orange, red. We know a lot about the budget. The state budget is pretty understandable. We actually get it, especially if we hire consultants to tell us what it means, which we do. We kind of have a good idea of contract and procurement data because there's a couple different sources that we can compare to each other. State authorities, we kind of look at, but it's all in PDF, so we can find stuff where we know what we're already looking for, but it's hard to analyze. Real estate transactions, property that's owned by authorities in the state government, we have no idea. It's a black box. So all the land that the state rents, buys, sells, all that stuff, there's no list. We don't know. We do not know what's going on. This is a huge deal. Anybody in the room who works in urban planning or land use stuff and knows about Atlantic Yards or Hudson Yards and how much controversy those aroused controversy because people knew what was going on. There's massive transaction that the government's engaged in that the public has very limited knowledge of. So, in fact, we don't know what we don't know in this area. Tax credits, $1.7 billion a year, many to unknown recipients, a big black hole. And charities. Charities are regulated by the State Attorney General's office. Tons of scandals surrounding charities, okay? There's tons of politics going into all this stuff. I'll tell you over lots and lots of beers. Basically, it boils down to this. Tax credits are supported by the right or rightish in most places, but not New York. But most tax credits go to businesses, and charities are mainly supported by grants for social service things. So scandals tend to be, for tax credits, tend to be more on the Republican side in New York, and charities tend to be more on the liberal Democratic side, if you want to break it down that way. State authorities, we talked about, opacity. State authorities exist outside of the rest of government. So I mentioned to you the state financial system, the SFS, which is the massive database of every single state transaction, does not include that $50 billion from those state authorities. They exist in their own separate worlds. Transparency process, I won't go into this, but this is what I was talking about with how data or transparency data has to go through lots of different steps, and at the end you can end up with nothing or crap, basically. And then back to FOIL. Freedom of Information Law, why people like you should think about it, know about it a little bit. It still really matters, and it's going to keep on really mattering because it's the only part of the open government, open information, transparency regime that has any kind of legal teeth and case law around it. So if the city of New York or the state of New York doesn't put up a data set and doesn't comply with the open data law or the open data executive order, there's really not that much that you can do about it. There's been no court cases in which, in fact, the public has no standing. There's no legal standing to sue government if they don't do that. If government does not comply with a FOIL request, you can go to court. And it's expensive and it's a pain in the ass, but you can still go to court and you will win. Everybody wins. 100% of FOIL cases, the public wins. The problem is that most of the public doesn't have $10,000 that they can pay a lawyer to litigate through the whole process. So we think FOIL in New York State and New York City is almost dysfunctional, that roughly somewhere around a half of FOIL requests are not fully complied with or responded to. But we don't know because there's no FOIL police and there's no disclosure mechanism. So we don't know how many FOIL requests New York State gets, how many New York State agencies get, and how they're responded to, which is very different than the federal government, which has very detailed laws on FOIL reporting. So this is a scary thing that people who are concerned with open government should know about, which is that our FOIL system is basically a black box that we just don't know about. How do we open the government? We have one thing that, one particular approach that we're looking at, but that's what I want to talk about with you. Like, what do we do next? You know, what makes sense here? Why do you guys do what you do? There's a couple different ways. One is revolution, you know, overthrow the oligarchs, send Lady Liberty up and, you know, or Zephyr Teach Out or whoever it is, and, you know, heads on pikes, really, really change things. Given where things are right now, that revolution does not seem to be here. I noticed that even Occupy Wall Street's like not marching around anymore, which is kind of a sad thing in terms of change. There's not tremendous ferment for that change right now. Or a more boring and longer term and geological approach, erosion. And I would say that where we are right now is more on the erosion side, but hopefully a little faster. And the power of that ocean is, again, it's the information revolution, it's mobile information, it's social network, it's the expectation that government or institutions are supposed to tell you what's going on, which is a somewhat new thing in human society. I mean, people for a long time have taken it for granted that they don't know anything and they never know anything. And so we think that this is going to change everything. And where we are right now is at the very beginning of this change. We're at the very beginning of the erosion, which we think is going to accelerate into a revolution. Because, as we know, mobile devices, social networks, even the internet, compared to our government, are very, very short, you know, have been here for a very short time. So what can you do? Well, let's talk about that. I mentioned opportunities for scraping. You know, wow, that's really exciting. But there are lots and lots of groups, not just Reinvent Albany, but civil society groups who desperately need to pull down government information, scrape it, find it, analyze it. And folks like yourself with the ability to write scrapers or to do things, to visualize data, or to otherwise help them figure out are tremendously valuable. So if there's something that lights your fire, a cause, you know, you want to know about city bike trips or whatever, like Noel does, then help the folks that are trying to figure that out. If you are interested in pure government transparency and spending issues, let us know. We will hook you up. We've got a ton of data to scrape and analyze, a ton. And so do other groups like ours, and we can help you get in touch with other folks. So that is, you know, a somewhat, you know, long and still cursory explanation of the world that I work in every day. But let's talk about whatever you want to talk about, and I'm happy to discuss, answer questions, what have you. So please, fire away. Yes.
Hi, I'm Tamar. I'm wondering so you sort of talk about two different things, like transparency and then engaging people with the technology that they already use all the time.
Yeah.
Like people who aren't necessarily so interested in, like, well, everyone is interested in government, like does their city take care of them? But I guess I'm wondering, like, what you think are potentially good tools to, like, transmit the information that you're making more transparent to, like, regular people. Like, is that a goal that you guys have, or is it sort of like you're more interested in like the kind of ridiculously not transparent things that should be
it's
like starting with that and then
yeah,
in
sure.
the long run?
No, it's definitely a goal. I would say that we're further up the data or the transparency chain than the people who are doing what you're talking about, but we're in the loop on that chain to talk to them, if I can mix up some geospatial metaphors or geometric. What you're talking about is something like what a couple borough presidents are working on, led by Gail Brewer, which is to create a community board-based visualization tool that is set up so that there's some easy default settings that allow them to interact with the city's open data platform more easily. So for instance, a community board manager can more easily type in, rodents, community board 7, and then that data is produced and then mapped. And Socrata and the Socrata platform that Chris runs has a lot of tools that are designed for data visualization, mapping, and to help make that data useful. So that's very, very important to us. That has not been scaled yet in New York City and not in New York State, and is just starting to happen. But yes, we're interested. We're not at the forefront of that.
Can I actually just say,
Yeah, sure.
So we have a group that has had a little bit of traction called the NYC Open Data Work Group, which is focusing exclusively on finding the data sets that need to be transformed in a way that increases accessibility or usability in the context of community boards. And we went through kind of this process at the beginning of the year where we're exploring it and found out that we were hampered by some of that data sets. And so now there's going to be a hearing in September where we'll have an opportunity to kind of present a laundry list of things that we want changed. And now with the New York City open data team actually having a staff, this is an opportunity that we want to strike while the iron is hot. And so anyone who's in this room who's interested, we have a working group, and it's been pretty active, and we have like over 50 data sets that we want transformed to make it easier to do this type of stuff. Sorry.
Please. Yes.
You mentioned that the public doesn't have much recourse in the face of non-compliance of the open data. Are they laws or are they just executive orders? What's the reason they have this?
Sure. Well, there's two in New York State. Where we are, there's two regimes. The city's open data law, which is a law, but that law does not have a private right of action. So you cannot sue the city as a private citizen to public right of action. To sue, you can't go to court. You have no standing. So the city can just violate the law as much as it wants to. The sanction would be city council chastising the mayor. And there's no penalty. It's just a matter of chastisement and public ridicule.
Parcel of the actual statute.
It doesn't say you will be humiliated. No.
There's no action. It's not actionable.
Correct. The state is under an executive order, Executive Order 95, which is being ignored because one of the key parts of the executive order is actually to create an inventory of all the data sets that state agencies have and a schedule of those data sets for release, and they're just ignoring it. And there's nothing we can do because the executive order is from the governor telling agencies what to do, and we have no recourse for that. Yeah. Other stuff. Nothing. Everybody got everything there, has no questions. I'm sure I said a lot of stuff that wasn't right, so, Yes?
Could you talk a little bit more about the email retention policy?
Sure. So New York State had 28 separate email systems going into roughly a year ago, and they consolidated them all into Microsoft 360. I think it's Microsoft 360. And they, as part of that, which seemed to make a lot of sense, frankly, given what they were operating previously. What they did when they did that is they snuck in this 90-day auto-destruct policy without telling anyone. It was just, in fact, there was a internal administrative, it was a memo. It was a memo in the state health department from the IT director of the state health department to employees saying, starting effective date when we adopt the Microsoft 365 or 360, your emails will be obliterated after 90 days unless you save them. So reminder that the state has archival retention schedules and you're supposed to comply with them. And that was it. And then a couple people had that leaked to them because there were people at the health department like, holy shit. And so anyway, that was about a year ago. And you know, honestly, we did not do a great job about responding immediately because we didn't understand the implications completely, and we didn't really understand the rationale. And you know, we tend not to try to think the worst of government all the time, despite what you might think. So anyway, it seems to us at this point like it's clearly an attempt to reduce transparency, period. That's about it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Preventing you from automating FOIL requests?
Say, I couldn't hear you, sorry.
What is preventing you from automating FOIL requests?
Preventing me?
Preventing email retention policy.
Well, email retention or FOIL?
Well, my question is directed in the sense that in order to avoid hitting the 90-day limit, why not send the FOIL request daily for all of the emails that are generated during that day?
So the Freedom of Information Law is powerful in so much as it gives you recourse to the courts, but if you file a FOIL request every single day, it will be ignored. And so then if you went to court and said, Judge, they ignored, the judge is just going to say, too bad. You know, like, put all of this into one place, tell me what you want here, and specifically exactly what you're aiming for. And you might be, maybe as a strategy for raising the profile, it might be a good,
But it still follows the process of the FOIL law, correct?
True, but remember, laws are just unlike in code, law is not law, right? I mean, so a law only, a law only exists in the mind of the people that choose to obey it. Otherwise, you have to go to court and make the people subject to the law obey it. And so FOIL law is just, it will just be ignored, I guess is the answer to your question. Yeah.
So I agree with you that open data or technology can really help create transparent government. But one of the things I worry about often is even if we had a lot of open data and we had complete transparency, there's just only so much information that I as an individual can absorb day to day.
Yeah.
So even if we had all this open data, what is the process for disseminating it so that we can actually act on it and create transparency?
Great question. We have journalists and the press, and one of the narratives that doesn't really go over really big in the kind of civic hacking or Code for America universe is the importance of traditional journalism, and the fact that the loss and the absolute destruction of paper journalism, and the fact that there's no real new business model has been really bad when it comes to government accountability, because the big newspapers have not been able to pay for the experienced reporters that had the sources and the connections in the same numbers that they used to do. And this is very well documented. The fact the Knight Foundation has done lots of reports about how many the reduction in reporters covering state government and city government. But a lot of what we do is really to help journalists and policy analysts who work for nonprofits and think tanks make their life easier. And there's no doubt that you have to have intermediaries to help perform the curatorial or editorial function, because you're right, the amount of information is infinite. And that civil society, journalists and NGOs, are the folks that are really fundamental to democracy and open government, and those are mainly our partners. And so day to day, that's who we're helping and working with on stuff. Yes, sir.
Kind of building off that, so relying on intermediaries in order to kind of make sense of the data that's being produced, how important is it, do you think, to have conversations with government and the agencies in order to actually produce sensible data in the first place?
Massively important. The only way this stuff really works is when civil society and the interest groups that are the key stakeholders for agencies are directly engaged with those agencies. And that otherwise it just simply doesn't work, because you have to have the domain expertise to know what you're looking at and to what to ask for. And so I will go. Yep, so like the state health department example, the reason the state health department worked is because there's a public health culture or paradigm of interaction with health researchers. And there's scientists within the health department whose peers are working in research institutions outside of government and academia that are collaborators. They work together every day on the same projects, and it's unusual in that way, but there's a constant communication about what they need versus what the government can provide. And so what we're seeing, and there's a reason that nationally that the US government under Todd Park did Health Data Palooza. I don't know if anybody saw that, but there was a reason they started with health stuff. The reason for that is because the soil was already fertile for that open data. They got it. You didn't have to talk to health researchers much about like, why should you do this? So the struggle for health has been more about data quality and metadata and actual production of the data in a way so that it could be used by the key stakeholder groups. In other places, the discussion is just stuck on suspicion and not wanting to give the public stuff, basically. Does that cover it?
No, I just wanted to echo that and say, like, it takes, at this point in the game, some sort of tribal knowledge, and you see that happen a lot, actually, on our email communication channels, is somebody shows up who's, like, new, and they're like, I'm studying this subject, and I'm looking for this data, and then the kind of people will chime in and say, like, here's where you go for it. And I think we need to get to that being something that is completely self-serve, and that's one of the aspirations of open data, is to make these things findable and discoverable, but we're definitely not there yet at all. So it takes groups like BetaNYC to be able to have, little kind of experts in each vertical who will always be able to chime in with that little piece of information that you wouldn't be able to get by Googling. And I think that's a really awesome thing about this group, but I think it also indicates that there's something missing still in the kind of discoverability of all this openness. It's still all kind of hidden in little pockets.
Let's say the really good thing, though, first, expert knowledge, domain knowledge, super important, because really, I mean, I'm an expert on the MTA budget, okay? There's maybe, a dozen people that know more about the MTA. I don't understand parts of the MTA budget when they come out. I have to look at them and I have to ask other people, oh, I saw this. What does this really mean to you? And this is something I've spent a long time looking at. It's like that in lots and lots of data sets, right? Because the universe of all data is infinite. It's everything everybody knows. So you have to have domain expertise to help you. You have to be able to call people and know where they go. The cool thing about what you guys are doing with BetaNYC is that you don't have to know everything about everything. All you have to do is get certain areas of knowledge to a very, very high level, or of data availability or open data, because then people in other areas of social change or advocacy or civil society or government can say, like, hey, look what they're doing with homeless data. How come we don't do this over here with data about, street trees, because a lot of the principles are the same. It's like, is the metadata good? How is the data structured? What's the reporting cycle for it? How fresh is it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where folks like you are very, very important, by bringing that expertise and insight into stuff, because you can't know everything about everything. It's impossible. That's okay. More other stuff. Nothing? Yes, sir.
So, like, in terms of bringing programmer expertise to bear, like, what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit for open data, like, at large, and what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit for New York State? Like, I guess another way to frame the question is, if you had, say, 1,000 person hours of dev time, like, what would you apply it to right away to get the biggest impact?
I don't know. It's a great question, though. I don't know, because I think a big part of that to get the biggest bang depends, again, on the level of internal cooperation. I will point out some things, like Scraper Wiki, for instance. Interesting thing in terms of, Scraper Wiki is great, but who here is scrape stuff, like hard, gnarly stuff? A lot of people here. You know that Scraper Wiki is good as a first step, right? It's just, you get stuff, and then people have to write script to get things to the next level and to really get the outputs that you want. We could use much, much more robust national or New York scraper expertise pooling. I will say that. I mean, if it was, folks were sharing exactly how they did stuff, methodologies, and they were open about it, and there was an open approach to, to that stuff, it would help a ton. Because there are a million groups that are scraping stuff right now. I mean, tons and tons and tons. So whatever you could do, and I guess this is more of creating a social structure, to absolutely pool scraping expertise of all different kinds and make it available, I think that would help a lot. That would really help.
To echo a specific working group that you could join in that example is the City Record Online project, is where we found out that we already have 1 year of data that's machine readable. We need to put that into a better schema, and then we can almost like overnight launch the fact that every single public meeting, public hearing from community board to decision is available, and you can have a notification app set up for that. But then we have to scrape essentially over 100 years of PDFs, or some of them are text selectable, some of them are need to be OCR'd, and then go through that process and figure out like what do we do with that shit. So.
Another question. So I'm like really disturbed with the 90-day policy. I actually recently finished working, I was working at the Manhattan DA's office, like investigating city employees, corrupt city employees, and like that's something that we would use a lot. Like, if you work with the city, your email is public. And like, what's his name? Hines, a lot of information about his, I guess, what he may or may not, what he was doing, like came through emails. So like, if I'm really disturbed by that, what can I do to like, involve myself in that?
Email us, talk to me. I'd love to talk about it more. I don't know why this is not freaking out the national movement yet, but this is not. I will tell you though that when we asked Code for America and Sunlight Foundation and the Washington groups, what city or state has the policy that you like the most? They said, we don't know, there is not one. And this is an area where open data advocacy collides with archivists, if you want to look at like generational stuff, and that's a whole huge talk, but the archivists are from a pre-open information architecture age, and they think in terms of paper. And everything they do is, trying to create a digital analog of paper rather than thinking about how are we actually truly digital. So this is an area where there's a lot of dumb stuff and bad thinking. And, boy, we would love a grant to help get people together and come up with stuff. The good news for New York City residents is that the city's retention policy, the default, like everything gets saved, the one that they're probably going to adopt is going to be a minimum of 5 years per regular worker. That's like, they're looking at 3 scenarios right now, and that's the shortest of all of them. And for appointed officials, it would be 30 years. So the city is not going that route. And I think that, in fact, it's the city archivist that is going to come up with the policy on that. But yeah, it's big. It's big, and I would expect other states to start doing bad things soon.
Most any of the industries that the state has auspices over to regulate, and will have requirements to hold things, 7 years probably.
Right.
So
that's true.
It's ironic that they would feel themselves not
Yeah,
obligated.
you're compelled to save tax records and other reporting things for a long time. Yes, sir.
Outside of journalism, which you mentioned, what are some of the most effective applications of open data to actually create change that you've seen in New York?
What kind of change?
Any change that you want to see using data as a lever, as a tool?
Well, I'm biased, but Transportation Alternatives has been using crash data for about 15 years. And we started the first ever, crash mapping platform in the United States, and which is now a little long in the tooth and hasn't really kept up. But when it came out, it was pretty ahead of its time, and that made a huge difference, because for the first time we were able to go to elected officials and say, see these dots? They're your constituents being killed. And that made a big impression. I think the Bicycling Livable Streets movement has been tremendous in their use of data in that way. I would point to a more recent release. I don't know if I want to call it open data, because it was really a FOIL case that lasted forever, but stop and frisk. the release of stop and frisk data, which happened when the NYCLU won a FOIL case, was enormous. And the fact that they mapped it and they analyzed that data, that was obviously enormous and led to, in part, to this mayor being elected. So the power of big data sets in the political system can be humongous. But those are just two examples, but there's many examples. Other stuff? No? Good. Yes?
Do you think it's an issue that every time like an agency comes up with data that they want to put on the internet, they create a whole separate website for it? I mean, we looked at a lot of different websites, and so it seems like the interfaces are all compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Is there a way to, do you think that it'd be useful to centralize in some way the online information?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ideas behind creating a centralized open data platform and open data policies and laws is that very, very thing. I think where we're going, and our group is going to start pushing, is that big agencies all have their own open data portal, and they federate the data upward to the mothership open data portal, because what we've learned is that agencies like to keep the data close to home, and that issue of control and direct access to be able to publish data is very, very important to them. So I suspect we're going to start seeing more of that. But we're still early. I mean, the NYPD, for instance, they have something like 250 data sets already on their website. And their website sucks. I don't know if anybody's looked at it, but you can't find anything. And one of their big goals, and interestingly enough, the NYPD actually has an open data team, and they're actually trying to do stuff. Well, their first big task is to take all PDFs, they're tabular, and turn them into CSVs. Everybody here likes that. And then their second one is to put them all in one place. And they want to keep it close to home. So it will be federated to the Socrata platform, or whatever the city's centralized open data platform, but they want to have direct access. And so I think the idea of federated data platforms has become quite common because of that desire for governance and close control. I think that's going to be the next evolution. I think one of the things we're learning from open data is that agencies do not like and are not very, especially, we're seeing it all over, but they're not into giving their data, what they perceive as giving their data away. So psychologically, that would be the inner step. But yes, for these websites, APIs will, if they have APIs that are proper, then that will solve a lot of the problem there. And in fact, the Open Book, the state comptroller site, should have an API on it by February for all their data. All their data should have APIs.
Can I add the next layer on top of all of that is figuring out that knowledge conversation that kind of Chris was talking about, like 20 minutes ago, is like, how do we create those pockets where there's internal knowledge within agencies and then external knowledge kind of like that are held within academia and public interest in individuals, and then how do we build collaborative communication streams so that way we can share kind of those insights. Because my fear is that we do end up in federated data land where everything is sitting off in their own silos, but that means that we have to go to one Google group, to another Google group, to another Google group, instead of figuring out how do we start federating all of those insights, because when we do our data science, we're actually combining a number of data sources together, and so how do you then see through a prism? So.
Awesome. Let me just add one thing that we just learned in the last year or so that I think people may find interesting. We've really come across this concept of what we call trusted partners. That is that it turns out that most government agencies have had academic institutions or think tanks that they like, that they're close to, as close data partners for a long time, and that people like us and you guys don't know that, and the agencies don't tell you. But it turns out that everyone, including the NYPD, for instance, have institutes, different policing think tanks that they give tons of stuff to that they don't give anybody else to. And so there's one of the things that we just kind of, was there's all kinds of scholarly journals that use city and state and government data and then have findings and charts and stuff. And you're like, how do they know that? Well, it turns out that the agencies give them tons and tons of data. So one of the things that's been like the dog that didn't bark in open data is that there haven't been traditional stakeholders in a lot of areas jumping up and down saying like, we want open data, we want open data. And we're like, well, why isn't this taking off as fast as it could? And it turns out the reason for that is because a lot of the stakeholders are already getting the data they want. So that, you know, for every agency that you look at, there's probably 2 or 3 key stakeholder groups that are getting everything they want already just informally. And that's been one of the big problems with creating a giant wave of enthusiasm for open data. Anyway, we just cottoned onto that. Sure.
You know, partner with them to piggyback on what they're getting?
They have no incentive to share. In fact, it's threatening to them because they like having a monopoly on that information for publishing and for appearing and leaking stuff to the press and doing reports that are cutting edge and all that stuff.
And a majority of them so there are very well-established educational institutions in the city that have non-disclosure agreements that get raw data from the city, and then they crunch the numbers, and they don't have to deal with certain privacy protections because they're as consultants, right? Or they have a special professional relationship with different agencies that that help circumvent some of the restrictions that if you were handing it out to the general public. And so this is also one of the incentives. It's a disincentive for them to work with us because they already have this raw access to data. They have a fiscal relationship even with the data. And so there's absolutely no need for them to be working with organizations that are asking for the data because we're just little piranhas eating at their toes. So
anyway, well, thank you all very much for sharing this time this night, and I'm happy to carry on over another beer. So thank you.
thank you, sir.